even some of the WNBA players, as Caitlin Clark was coming into the league, energy, passion, support for the league, ticket sales, viewership, like.
For most athletes, entering a professional league means navigating a learning curve, adapting to the speed of the game, earning the respect of veterans, and proving that the talent that made them exceptional at the college level can translate to a professional setting. That adjustment period is expected, accepted, and largely unremarkable. What has unfolded around Caitlin Clark since she entered the WNBA is not that. It is something considerably more complicated, more visible, and more difficult for the league and its surrounding media apparatus to explain away. The conversation no longer belongs exclusively to fans debating on social media or analysts filling broadcast time. It has moved into the domain of credentialed, experienced voices, individuals who have spent careers inside professional locker rooms, navigated league politics from both sides, and understand the difference between competitive intensity and something more deliberate. When those voices begin confirming what millions of viewers have been observing since the start of Clark's professional career, it warrants serious examination rather than dismissal. A five-time NBA champion with direct experience in women's professional basketball recently addressed this subject on 97.1 The Fan. His remarks were not speculative. They were measured, direct, and grounded in a career's worth of institutional knowledge. He acknowledged what many in the sport have been reluctant to state plainly, that the hostility directed at Clark is real, patterned, and not adequately addressed by the institution responsible for protecting her. His confirmation did not introduce a new argument. It validated one that had been building for months across comment sections, broadcast replays, and post-game conversations. It moved the discussion from fan perception into the territory of documented professional concern. That context matters because the pushback against Clark's critics has consistently relied on the assumption that discomfort with her treatment is largely emotional, the reaction of an enthusiastic fan base misreading competitive basketball. The reality, when examined through game footage and officiating data, is less ambiguous than that framing suggests. The officiating record around Clark has been a consistent focal point of viewer frustration, and for reasons that hold up under scrutiny. Across the WNBA's current landscape, players at the elite level receive foul calls at rates that reflect both their skill and their market value to the league. That is not an unusual dynamic in professional sports. Stars generate traffic, and traffic generates foul calls. What viewers have noted, repeatedly and specifically, is that Clark operates under a different standard. She is contacted on screens with force that would draw fouls in most other matchups. She is pushed off her line on drives. She absorbs contact on shot attempts that officials allow to pass without a whistle. The comment sections of every major breakdown video covering her games reflect a consistent pattern of frustration. That Clark has, as one widely repeated viewer observation put it, the worst whistle in the entire league. That characterization is not simply an expression of fan loyalty. It reflects something that multiple analysts, former players, and now championship-level voices have corroborated. The standard applied to Clark does not mirror the standard applied to other marquee players in the league. That disparity is measurable, it is visible on replay, and it raises legitimate questions about whether the officiating structure is functioning as it should around the league's highest-profile player. What makes the officiating question particularly pointed is the broader narrative it contradicts. One of the most persistent criticisms directed at Clark from certain corners of sports media is that she benefits from favoritism, that the league's investment in her marketability translates into preferential treatment from officials. That argument does not survive contact with the game footage. A player who is routinely fouled without a call, who absorbs contact on nearly every drive without protection, and who draws fewer free throw attempts than the nature of her playing style would logically generate, is not a player receiving preferential officiating. She is a player receiving less protection than her peers, not more. The gap between that reality and the narrative being advanced in certain media environments is significant enough to constitute its own story. Commentators who spent years either ignoring or actively celebrating aggressive play against established veterans discovered a sudden investment in civility and sportsmanship the moment those behaviors were directed at Clark. Though the direction of their concern was not toward the players delivering the contact, but toward Clark herself. Moments of animated interaction between Clark and her bench, the kind that happened dozens of times a night across professional sports without generating coverage, were amplified into character assessments. The selective attention was visible, and viewers noticed it. The double standard has been a sustained source of frustration in Clark's audience base, and it surfaces consistently in viewer feedback. Comments reflecting unease with the way her conduct is scrutinized relative to identical conduct from other players are not isolated reactions. They form a pattern of concern that the media coverage of Clark is operating under different rules than the coverage applied to her peers. Those concerns are grounded in observable examples, incidents that received sustained negative coverage when involving Clark and received either minimal coverage or positive framing when involving other players in comparable situations. The league's relationship with Clark extends beyond the court, and that dimension of the story carries its own set of unresolved tensions. When the volume of crowds following her movement through commercial airports reached a scale that created genuine logistical and security complications, the WNBA adjusted its travel infrastructure. The practical result was an industry-wide shift toward private air travel, an upgrade that benefited every player on every roster. That upgrade was a direct consequence of Clark's drawing power. The response from portions of the veteran player community and certain media figures was to frame the change as evidence of special treatment rather than as a structural improvement that the sport's economic trajectory had finally made possible. That framing reflected a broader discomfort that has been evident since Clark entered the league. The arrival of a player whose commercial impact was both immediate and transformative forced an adjustment in how the sport was perceived, resourced, and discussed. That adjustment was not universally welcomed. In certain cases, the resistance to it produced public behavior, including on-court interactions, that drew significant viewer concern and commentary. Those incidents generated sustained discussion in Clark's audience, with many viewers expressing that the management of those situations by the league and by individual franchises reflected poorly on the institution as a whole. The Indiana Fever's organizational response to Clark's arrival has been the subject of specific, recurring criticism. The franchise benefited immediately and substantially from her presence, sellouts became standard, national television contracts followed, and the commercial profile of the team expanded in ways that had not been achievable in prior seasons. The expected institutional response to that kind of impact would be proportional investment in roster construction, in coaching support, in the development of an infrastructure capable of protecting and developing a generational talent. What viewers have observed, and what the comment feedback reflects, is concern that the organization has been slow to deliver on that obligation. The coaching dimension of that concern has been consistent. Stephanie White's in-game decision-making, specifically around rotation management and late-game adjustments, has drawn sustained criticism from a viewer base that watches closely and evaluates what it sees. The concern is not abstract. It is rooted in specific moments, rotation decisions that reduced Clark's effectiveness during critical stretches, timeout usage that appeared reactive rather than strategic, and late-game situations where tactical choices did not reflect the leverage that Clark's presence creates on the floor. Viewers watching those games and reflecting on them in comment sections are not imagining those patterns. They are documenting them. The organizational failures extend into merchandising and marketing. Multiple seasons into the most significant commercial surge in the WNBA's history, basic infrastructure around Clark's brand presence remains underdeveloped. Signature merchandise lines that should have been in production and distribution by the conclusion of her first season are still absent from shelves. That is not a minor operational oversight. It represents a failure to capitalize on a commercial window that required speed and organizational competence to maximize. The league collected the revenue generated by Clark's presence while failing to build the structures necessary to sustain and expand that presence in the market. The pattern, taken in full, describes an institution that has absorbed the benefits of a transformative talent without fully accepting the responsibilities that accompany that transformation. That is not an unusual dynamic in sports history. It is, however, an uncomfortable one to sustain when the talent in question is visible enough and the media environment attentive enough that the gaps between institutional rhetoric and institutional behavior become apparent to a mass audience. The historical context for what Clark is experiencing provides some framework, though it does not diminish the specificity of her situation. Transcendent athletes who arrive in established leagues with existing hierarchies and entrenched stakeholders routinely encounter resistance. The form of that resistance varies: physical targeting, media scrutiny, institutional indifference, or some combination. But the underlying dynamic is consistent. Established orders do not yield to disruption without friction. The degree of disruption Clark represents, measured by television ratings, attendance figures, sponsorship revenue, and cultural reach, is substantial enough to generate friction at multiple levels simultaneously. What distinguishes her situation from historical precedents is the scale and speed of the commercial transformation she catalyzed, combined with the sustained visibility of the resistance. Previous generations of transformative athletes navigated institutional friction largely outside of the public's direct observation. The current media environment ensures that almost nothing remains invisible for long. Every significant on-court interaction is available for immediate replay and analysis. Every officiating decision is subject to frame-by-frame review. Every organizational choice, from roster construction to merchandise strategy, is evaluated in real time by an audience that is both knowledgeable and motivated. That visibility is, in its own way, a form of protection, not institutional but public. The audience watching Clark's games is not passive. It is paying attention, cross-referencing what it sees, and holding the relevant institutions accountable in the way that contemporary audiences hold institutions accountable. Through sustained, organized commentary that creates reputational pressure. The comment sections of every major video covering Clark's career are not simply expressions of fan enthusiasm. They are records of observation, and they reflect a level of analytical engagement with officiating, coaching decisions, and organizational behavior that is uncommon in sports coverage. That engagement has been sustained because the underlying concerns have not been resolved. Officiating inconsistency remains a documented reality. Organizational support for Clark at the franchise level remains a subject of legitimate concern. Media coverage of her conduct continues to apply standards that differ from those applied to other players in comparable situations. The cumulative weight of those unresolved issues is reflected in the tone of viewer feedback. Not primarily as frustration with Clark's performance, which has been exceptional, but as frustration with the environment she is required to perform within. The championship-level voice that entered this conversation recently did so with full knowledge of that environment. His remarks on 97.1 The Fan were not made casually or without consequence. Individuals with his professional standing do not typically insert themselves into active debates about league culture without some degree of confidence in what they are observing and saying. His decision to address the targeted hostility directed at Clark, and to do so plainly, was a deliberate act. It reflected a judgment that the situation had reached a point where silence from credentialed voices was itself a form of complicity with the narrative being used to dismiss the concerns of Clark's audience. His intervention did not resolve the underlying issues. The officiating standard will not change because one prominent voice raised concern. The organizational decisions at the franchise level will not accelerate because external pressure was applied through a radio segment. The media double standard will not evaporate because a respected former player named it. What his remarks accomplished was more specific and perhaps more durable. They made it harder to maintain the position that the concerns around Clark's treatment are primarily the product of an overly protective fan base misreading competitive basketball. That argument was already under strain. The frequency and specificity of documented incidents, replays of uncontested contact, analyses of free throw disparities, frame-by-frame examinations of plays that drew no whistle, had accumulated to a point where dismissing the pattern required active avoidance of the evidence. The addition of a credentialed, experienced external voice stating plainly what the evidence suggests removes one of the remaining arguments available to those who prefer the simpler narrative. What remains is the harder question: what the league, the franchise, and the media institutions covering women's basketball intend to do with the situation they have created and sustained. The commercial case for a different approach is not subtle. Clark's presence has produced measurable, documented, unprecedented revenue generation across every relevant category. The return on investment from protecting, supporting, and developing that presence is not a theoretical projection. It is demonstrated by the data that already exists from her time in the league. The institutional case for a different approach is less frequently articulated, but it is no less real. The long-term credibility of the WNBA as a professional league, one capable of identifying, developing, and retaining transformative talent, depends in part on whether the organizations within it can demonstrate that they are equipped to handle what genuine success looks like. A franchise that sells out arenas and then fails to build the infrastructure around its centerpiece player is not demonstrating institutional competence. A league that generates record revenue from a player and does not prioritize her safety or accelerate her marketing presence is not demonstrating institutional stewardship. These are the assessments that viewers are making, individually and collectively, in every comment section and every broadcast conversation about Clark's career. They are not assessments grounded in unrealistic expectations. They are grounded in the straightforward observation that the obligations institutions have toward their most consequential assets have not been met. Whether the relevant institutions choose to meet those obligations going forward is a question that will be answered through action rather than through commentary. The evidence of what Clark represents to the sport is already complete and unambiguous. The decision about what to do with that evidence remains open, and the audience that has been watching this situation develop with unusual care and attention will continue watching, evaluating, and recording what it sees. The record so far is not flattering to the institutions involved. The question is whether that record will be revised, or whether the pattern will continue into the next chapter of a career that has already generated more attention, revenue, and cultural impact than the sport has seen in a generation.